I don't know what to tell you, but you messed up. But you have time to fix your mistake. Hey everybody, this is Matt from Matt's Fantasy Book Reviews, and we are back for another edition of the countdown of my top 100 best fantasy books of all time. Today we're going to be going through number 40 through 31. So let's just jump right on into it with number 40, and that is The Gathering Storm by Brandon Sanderson, written in 2009. This is the 13th book in the Wheel of Time series, and the first one by Brandon Sanderson. If you weren't aware, the Wheel of Time is written by two different people. Robert Jordan is the creator, and he wrote the first 12 of the entries. Really 13 because he wrote a prequel book, but let's just call it 12 because that prequel book is not great in my opinion. Then Brandon Sanderson came in after Robert Jordan sadly passed away and finished out the series by writing books 13, 14, and 15. So this is the first of those three books, and it's on this list for a number of reasons. One of them is about how hard this book must have been to create. Taking over a beloved series like The Wheel of Time and not just doing an adequate job, but doing an amazing job is crazy. I mean, you have all of these pre-existing characters that while Brandon Sanderson clearly was a major fan of The Wheel of Time, it's one thing to be a fan of something and another thing to take that as your own and to run with it. And I have to applaud him for doing such a magnificent job. And I know this is probably kind of blasphemy to say for many reasons, but I think Brandon Sanderson's three books were the best of The Wheel of Time because he took all of the positive things that Robert Jordan had and he duplicated them. But then he took some of the negative things that I thought that Robert Jordan did and fixed them. And some of those things were in the plot progression and the structure of the stories. You know, I always thought that Robert Jordan did a really good job of this really slow build, where obviously there was some action going on, but really the books can be summarized as a lot of lead up into a major bang at the end of the book. And while Brandon Sanderson is kind of famous for doing something similar, what I think he does a little bit more subtly is he sets up all of these pieces that towards the end of the book, it's not so much an explosion that happens, but it's a set of dominoes that get clicked down because of how good he is at coming up with the structure of this story beforehand and just executing it to perfection. I thought that his writing was a little bit better too. You know, if I never knew that a change of authors happened, it would have still felt like, man, something improved here. And I don't know, I can't put my finger on what it is. Because I just feel like he's a little bit better at writing straight kind of to the point and getting all the information across that's needed. You know, he didn't spend all this needless time, you know, setting up every single item that's on a desk when you walk into a room. All this over-the-top detail of things that as a reader, that's not what I'm into fantasy books for. And I appreciated that he kind of cleaned up those aspects of the book in a really good way. You know, I think this book really was not like a middle book syndrome kind of thing, but it was clearly moving all the pieces in the right direction to set up for this final battle that's going to be happening in two books. I can't get into details of the plot because, I mean, we're 13 books in. Pretty much mentioning anything about the plot is going to ruin something. But I think the one thing I can say that's not spoiler-filled, that explains a little bit about the plot that I liked, is I really liked 𝐒𝐥𝐸ine, if that's how you say her name. I did not listen to audiobooks. I read these physical. But 𝐒𝐥𝐸ine's story involving the White Tower I thought was very gripping. It showed a different side of her that I didn't get before. I was never a major fan of hers going into this book. I thought she was okay. But I had a lot of problems with the character that I didn't think would ever get solved, and it confused me about why so many people claim that they are in love with this character. Well, I think a lot of that love stems from this book and beyond, because she turns into a much better person and solves the problems that are in front of her in a way that she would not have earlier in the series. It shows a lot of character growth, and I love to see that in my characters. So yeah, this book really transformed my opinion of her, and not just her, but I thought the whole storyline and the plot was so engaging. I was cheering. I was on the edge of my seat. It was wonderful stuff, and I really highly recommend this book to everybody. You know, if you're stuck in that slog of those 3 books that everyone talks about, I think the slog is 1 book, but almost everybody says it's 3. And you're like, man, I don't know if I should push on. You really should. You've invested so much time to get to that point that it really becomes back to greatness. I think in the book before this, but this one certainly continues that trend. Number 39 is A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie. This is written in 2019, and this is book 1 of 3 of The Age of Madness. Now, The Age of Madness is the 2nd trilogy in the First Law, but it's the 7th overall book, the 7 of 9, because the First Law had an initial trilogy, and then it had 3 standalone books, and then it had this final trilogy. And I know it's kind of a controversial opinion. I think a very large controversial opinion, but I think that the Age of Madness trilogy is more than a little bit better than the initial trilogy. And I loved the initial trilogy, but I am obsessed with the 3 books that comprise the Age of Madness. And it all started right here. You know, like I just talked about with the Brandon Sanderson thing, I think Joe Abercrombie had a major challenge ahead of him to make a successful book and a successful trilogy here, because he utilized a time jump. And time jumps are very difficult to pull off as an author. And what I mean by that is he took these characters that we knew and loved, and he skipped a generation. He went to the children of some of these main characters and told their story in this world. A lot of time has passed. A lot of events have changed. A lot of events are the same too. But to take this new cast of characters and succeed is very, very hard. And not a lot of authors have the skill to pull it off like Joe Abercrombie did here. You know, I was nervous going into this book because I thought the standalones, in another controversial opinion, were a pretty big step down from the initial trilogy. I liked some of them more than others, but in general, you know, I didn't rate any of them over a 4 out of 5 stars, and this is one of my favorite series of all time in the First Law. And so, in part of that's my bias in that I really do love longer series that can kind of slowly unfold the action and really settle the pieces to knock them down, and it's hard to do that in a standalone book. And so, even then, though, I just thought the plots weren't nearly as good as the first or this trilogy. And so, yeah, I went into this very nervous, but I was just wrong. Joe Abercrombie kept all of his writing quality and was really showcasing it in this book with an amazing plot to go along. Now, he very clearly borrowed some very heavy inspiration from real-life events, namely the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. They're both showcased here in this First Law world. You know, you have this total change in a dynamic with the industry's perspective and people that are taking over large portions of industry and you know, capitalizing off of it. And at the same time, you have a major revolt against the leadership of the country here. And it's fun. Now, I won't claim this is the only Revolution book that I've ever read set in a fantasy landscape. That's not a terribly unique setting, but I think it's the best one that I've ever read about. And it really captured the raw, gritty, dark nature that goes along with these revolutions. They're not pretty affairs. They are horrific affairs that spelled trauma for a great many people. And I think the First Law series with Joe Abercrombie writing it is the perfect kind of person to write that story because of how dark his writing is. Now, his books really stand out for a number of reasons, but one of them is the amazing character work. Now, some of the characters are carryovers from the previous series, but they don't get major roles. This is mainly about the next generation. I don't want to claim and say who they are because that ruins the fates of some of their parents in the previous books, but I just will say that they're amazing. They come that classic Joe Abercrombie thing where you think they're black and white. You know, you think you have them figured out. But as the books go along, you realize that they have a lot more depth than you thought. There are a lot more gray characters than you thought. You can see their arguments for a lot of things and why they might be right, even though they're probably horrible people. And it makes you really kind of look inner about your own self and what does that mean about me when I'm reading this book. I also think Joe Abercrombie did an amazing thing with this trilogy by writing them all at the same time. He didn't get into that George R.R. Martin thing where he writes himself into these holes. Because when you write all the books at the same time and you get yourself into a hole, you can get yourself out of it because you don't have a book published yet. I love when an author is able to do that. I don't know that it's easy for authors to do if you're not successful already. I know that Michael J. Sullivan did that with Rhaenyra. I think he wrote those initial Rhaenyra books all at once. But it's a very smart way to do things, and I wish more authors would do it. This first trilogy that was written really formed the backdrop for these books because it informed kind of like the actions and the attitudes of all the characters in this generation. So I've heard some people say that you can read these books first. I highly recommend against it. You're going to lose so much value out of not understanding the characters and what makes them who they are. You'll get the plot. The plot's not going to confuse you. It's not, coming at you at all these different angles. Number 38 is Ruin by John Gwynne. This is written in 2015, and this is book 3 of 4 in The Faithful and the Fallen. One of my all-time favorite series of all time. Again, I can't talk too much about the plot here. I gotta keep this kind of vague because I don't want to ruin anything for a series that I love so much in my heart. Go pick it up if you haven't done it yet. But this book was crazy, fast, epic action. It had everything you'd want out of like huge, fantasy version of an explosion AAA movie. This is what this book had. I love that this was a quartet. I think this would not have done as well if it was a trilogy. It was able to space things out so well, with the first book being heavy setup, with the second book really popping things off, with the third book with things kind of coming to a crescendo and things finally wrapping up in that fourth book. But man, this book was action-packed. I am addicted to these characters by this point in the series and the character growth that has gone on here. One character in particular, I don't want to say this character's name, but John Gwynne did something, in this book it really got developed, but he took a character that started off as the definition of a side character, somebody that you would not have even blinked an eye if they died in the book, an afterthought, and turned them into one of the greatest characters in the history of fantasy books. And if you've read this series, you know exactly who I'm talking about. It's so cool to see this character get a little bit more attention each time. I think that he got his own POVs in the second book. I know they showed up in this third book. But as you're reading this third book, you're like, is this character this badass? Or is this about them? I mean, how involved is this character? And when you hear me talk about the final book in this series, which you're going to hear about way, way later in this top 100 list, I'll go into a lot more depth about what I loved about this character. But needless to say, I love what John Gwynne did. And I want more authors to do what he's done here. Take a side character and make them a main character. That is cool. I love that the series got a darker and darker tone as it went along. It didn't have the same kind of color palette that you'd see in most books. Most books keep things consistent as they go along. That's one of the things, it's hard for authors to vary things so much. And for John Gwynne to just say, you know what, this is a huge, huge battle that is defining generations to come. And that's not a pretty affair. And the book tone needs to change to accommodate that. Now, that's a hard thing to do for any author. But for an author that has never written a series before, never written a book before he started the series, is incredible. And it makes me wonder, man, if he would have started earlier, it's crazy what that career would have turned into. Because this guy writes banger after banger when it comes to books. I've never read a John Gwynne book that was anything less than amazing. I also thought here that there are no weak point of views. At any point, I think of my all-time favorite fantasy series and almost all of them have point of views where I might not hate them, but I kind of groan a little bit when I see that name popping up on the front of that chapter, because I want to get to the other characters that I like more. I'm cool with you, you know, Sansa Stark, but I want to read about Jon. I want to read about Tyrion. Let's go a little faster while I'm reading this and maybe not suck everything in that I normally would to get to those fun chapters. Yeah, that's not the case here. Every single time it ends and it gets to a new chapter, I'm just as excited as I was for the previous one, and that is awesome. Now, on one negative I will say about this book is it ends on the definition of a cliffhanger. Now, that's not as big of a problem when the book series is already out and you can just pick up that last book right away, but I cannot imagine the pain that must have gone through readers that were reading this book when it first came out. It must have felt like you were waiting eons to get to that final book. And I always hate it when authors do this. John Gwynne does this all the time. He hasn't stopped doing it. He just did it in his most recent book too, and it's just, I'm feeling the pain now, and it sucks. But if you're reading this book, plan on reading the next one right away, because you are not going to be able to wait a single moment to get to it. Number 37 is Towers of Midnight by Brandon Sanderson. This was written in 2010. It is book 14 of 15 of The Wheel of Time. Earlier in the video, we talked about number 13, and this is the next one. And I kind of feel bad about putting this on the list right here. I know from a viewability perspective, it would have been much better if I would have spaced this into a different video, but I need to be honest with myself when I'm doing these rankings and rank things where I really see fit, regardless of how fun it is to watch. So because of that, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this one, because I just kind of talked about the same thing a little while ago. I'll say a couple unique things though. The pace of this book picked up even more than from the previous one. You know, there is this enormous buildup, but things are moving fast. You can see all of the pieces getting put into place, and by the end of this book, it's like, okay, I know what's going on here. I know how this final showdown is going to take place from a set piece perspective. And a lot of this book was wrapping up certain storylines, you know, answering some questions, a lot of questions, asking a couple new ones, and really just getting things set up for the final book. Now, when I say set up, that sounds like a bad thing. It's not in this case. There were so many things to love about this book. You know, I think the second half of this book absolutely exploded and did not let up from the pedal until the book finished. You know, I think that there was a huge surprise in this book. And if you read it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's not really a surprise. I think anybody that's a fan of fantasy books saw it coming about, I don't know, 50 miles away. But it's nice that it finally happened so that we can now move on. You know, it was clear that that piece needed to be played before the final book happened. And even though I saw it coming and everyone saw it coming, it didn't make it less satisfying that, oh man, we're finally here. I'm so happy that it finally happened. Now let's move on. And I can be very happy about the dynamic that is now in place for me to continue on with the series. So yeah, I love this book. I don't love it as much as the final book. I think the final book in this series is the best of The Wheel of Time. And I can't wait to talk to you about it, not in this video, but in one very soon. Number 36 is Orb, Sceptre, Throne by Ian C. Esslemont. This was written in 2012, and it is book 4 of 6 of Novels of the Malazan Empire. Now, I don't think this book is going to show up on a lot of similar lists like that. I don't know if anybody's ever done a series like this, but if they did, you're not going to find this one up this high. It just has a dear, dear place in my heart. I love Malazan, and I haven't got to talk about it a lot in this series because I love it so much that those books show up later on in the series. But Ian C. Esslemont did such a wonderful job at continuing on the groundwork that was laid by Steven Erikson. Steven Erikson wrote Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's a 10-book series. He has wrote other books in this universe, but he is most famous for writing those 10 books. Now, Ian C. Esslemont wrote a lot of, I don't want to call them companion books, but he wrote books that took place around the same time as those events, but looked at different things that were happening. And mainly they used newer characters, some carryover characters, but a lot of new ones too. This book switched it up. This book said, let us continue on in the same city with all the same characters, with a couple little minor ones thrown in from one of the other books, 𝐒𝐨𝐜𝐢𝐚𝐥. And let's just write about those characters again. And that is hard. I talked about that before with Brandon Sanderson, and Esslemont did a magnificent job of keeping true to these characters. So at the end of 𝐒𝐨𝐜𝐢𝐚𝐥, which is the 8th book in Malazan, it ends a story arc, kind of. And you don't get to come back to the location that that book mostly took place in. And the story moves on, and it tells the end of the tale split up into 2 books. That's really one major story, books 9 and 10. And you don't really get to see the conclusion or the next step for a lot of these characters. So this book just slaps right on. It doesn't take place immediately after 𝐒𝐨𝐜𝐢𝐚𝐥. It takes place kind of concurrently with the final book in the series, The Crippled God. And a lot of people I've heard recommend that read this book right after you finish 𝐒𝐨𝐜𝐢𝐚𝐥. Bad idea. Don't do that. Don't do that at all, because some major things are going to get ruined for you. There's no reason to split it up like that unless you're doing a reread and you already know what happens. And then it might be fun to do it. When I do a reread, I think I will do that. But definitely don't do it for your first time. You would be ruining some major things. I thought that the plot, the pacing, the characters was just perfectly Malazan. It worked so well. And I've heard from so many people, and it got me turned off to Esslemont, that said, yeah, the Esslemont books are good, but they don't touch the Erikson books. And I think largely that statement is true, but it's overblown. I have this book ranked as my 36th favorite fantasy book of all time. That's a very, very high score. And it's not even my highest scored Esslemont book. You're going to see one show up later. But it's just so good. I love that it kept that same tone together. I thought that he did such a good job at writing these characters, with the exception of one. I thought he wrote the character of Kruppa. I think that's how you say his name. He missed. Ian Esslemont is not as funny as Steven Erikson. And so to write a character that is absolutely hilarious like Kruppa and trying to duplicate that effort is very difficult, and he just missed. It has a lot of the same aspects of the character without the comedy, and the comedy is what makes the character stand out. So yeah, other than that, knocked it out of the park. Now, he also investigated a group of people called the Segula that I am entranced with, and gave us a lot more detail and background and culture from this group of people that I really wanted to know more about. And essentially, these are these masked warriors. Think like ninja warriors that are so far beyond the martial capabilities of virtually everybody else on this planet that it's astounding. They have this complete fighting code about them where they're constantly competing with each other. They all know their rank in society. There's the first, the second, the third, the fourth. They're constantly challenging each other to move up in that ladder. They are incredible fighters, and I love to read more about these characters. It just kind of blew my mind, some of the aspects to the story, and how they had some people that are not Segula be within their ranking system because they acknowledged them as that's about how good they would be in our society. It's so fun to read about. If you have put off reading the Esslemont and you finished Malazan Book of the Fallen, I don't know what to tell you, but you messed up. But you have time to fix your mistake. Go pick up these books. I guarantee that you'll at least like them. Number 35 is The Wandering Inn, Book 1 by Pirateaba. This is written in 2018, and this is book 1 of 7 of The Wandering Inn. Now, when I say book 1 of 7, what I mean is there's only been 7 there's only been 7 ebooks that have been released on this. There's a lot more, like multiple Wheel of Time's worth of pages in this series that are already out, but they're in online form. You can only read them on the website of thewanderinginn.com. I like to read my books on Kindle, and for Kindle, there's only 7 books out. This is the first of them. This series is rocking me to my core with how good it is, and how much better it is than my expectations would ever say it would be. This series is not for me, I feel like, but it just works so well. What this is imagine a group of young adults in their like 20 to 25-year-old range who instantly, without knowing what happened, got transported from modern-day Earth into a Dungeons and Dragons-ish world, complete with a leveling system, a class system. The main character, within the first day that she gets transported over there, ends up deciding that she wants to be an innkeeper, takes over this abandoned inn, and when she goes to sleep that night, she gets a notification that she is now the innkeeper class, and she gets a certain set of skills to go around it. It's so addicting to read, especially if you're a video game fan like me. I love RPG video games, and this just works so well. And part of the reason it works well, and I was talking to some people in the Discord about it. If you haven't joined the Discord, check out the link in the description. It's a great place to talk spoiler-filled discussions about all these things in a lot more detail, and I'm always online. I'd love to talk to you. Please join. But I was talking to some people about what makes this series so well, and what about the RPG aspects of this that make it so good. And one of the things we talked about was that lit RPG, which is what literary RPG, it's a subgenre of fantasy that a lot of them do is they go too heavy on the RPG fronts. Like, you have to get like manuals to follow along with what's going on, and they get these detailed like this much strength, this much dexterity, and this is what this move means, this is what that move means, and it takes you out of the story a little bit. This one takes all the addicting aspects of it, but simplifies them a little bit. You don't need to read some companion material to understand what's going on. In fact, it's so much better if you don't do that. Because you get to be confused along with the characters. The characters all of a sudden get a class. And in general, they're like, okay, I get what that means. I'm an innkeeper. I know what an inn is. I know what that job is. But then it'll say, you got this special skill. And they're sitting there saying, I don't know what that means. Let's figure out how it manifests itself. And sometime within the next chapter or two, something will happen when it becomes very evident to both them and the reader about, oh wow, I now have this special capability that I did not have before. And it's so fun to read about. That's the word I keep coming back to when I read this series. It's just dang fun. It's not the highest peak of fantasy literature you're ever going to read from a quality perspective, but it might be one of the most fun you're ever going to read. And at the end of the day, isn't that really like the most important criteria that we would look at when reading books? How much did you enjoy your experience? Take away all the other outside noise about what makes a good book good and what makes it bad. Was it fun to read? Heck yeah, this was. It's amazing. In this first book, it's quite long, but it actually does have like a beginning, middle, and end to it, which do a really good job at changing the tone of the book in a darker one. And it doesn't stay dark. It kind of balances between it. But this book starts off as this kind of slice of life, low stakes fantasy. But by the end of it, it's like straight horror. Not blood and guts, terrifying horror, but it's got these very strong horror elements with a couple major characters that show up that are like these big, bad, evil characters that they're trying to fight against in this kind of horrific environment, in this kind of underground labyrinth kind of thing. It's really fun to read about, to see this author have so much quality that they can blend all these different genres together and make something really special. Now, this book series is the longest book series of all time. It's a great series to get hooked on because there is a crazy amount of depth to this, and it keeps getting written at a crazy pace, like 50 to 60,000 words per week, which is like half the size of a full-length novel. It's crazy how much this author writes, and it keeps getting better. Now, I have this book on my list. I just finished up the third book that is not going to show up on this list because I made the list before I read it, but that third book is even better than this one. It would show up much higher in this list. I can't wait to see what the series has in store, and I hope that you can join this journey with me and give this a shot. It's free. Go to thewanderingin.com, read some of the chapters, see if it's for you, and then buy the Kindle version if you want to do that, or just keep reading it online. It's free. Does it get any cheaper than that? Nope. Number 34 is The Trouble with Peace, another Joe Abercrombie book, this one written in 2020. And this is book 2 of 3 of The Age of Madness. I told you I like The Age of Madness. All 3 books are going to show up on this list. Now, just like earlier with the Brandon Sanderson books, I'm not going to take a ton of time reading them and talking to you about this because I've already talked to you about it. But let me just say a couple things. One is, very clearly there's no middle book syndrome here. This book took the story and amplified it to an even better degree. I love so much about what this book did. It did not have like an ending to it in that sense, but it didn't leave you hanging. It didn't feel like it didn't need to be written. It didn't feel like it was just trying to connect the beginning to the end. It felt like its own thing and really amplified my addiction to these characters even more. You know, it was full of action, it had solid developments, it had great resolutions, and it just left me hungry to finish up this series. You know, I think the cast by this point was turning out to be just as good as the original trilogy, which is crazy to say, because that original trilogy had 2 characters that are 2 of my favorite characters of all time. One of them is Logan Ninefingers. He is just amazing for all the right reasons. You know, a kind of bad character that's trying to be good, who's got this crazy strength to him, an amazing warrior that you just want to read more about. And then it's got on the other side, Sanderson, who might be my favorite character in all of fantasy. He's this evil torturer that, you know, is a cripple, you know, kind of in large part very different than Logan Ninefingers. But the characters here are just as good. I love so many of the characters. I love all the characters. But I love them in part because I hate them. None of them are good people. They all have very big faults to them. Even the ones that I thought were a little good, I should have second-guessed myself because I knew Joe Abercrombie doesn't write that kind of character. He writes bad people that are sometimes trying to do good things, or some like good people that are doing really bad things, or mixes between them. But I love, you know, I think there's this kind of common thing right now about too many authors are trying to write gray characters, and Joe Abercrombie's that guy. He is full of that, but he does it so good. You know, I think he's one of the best that's ever been for writing great characters, and he's really showcasing them in this series. I think the battle sequences here were just amazing. You know, he is like top 2 for my favorite battle sequence writers of all time, the other one being John Gwynne. He just does such a good job, and in this book he did this thing that he did in one of his standalones, The Heroes, that he used it again here, and it's such a cool trick, and he's telling this battle from somebody's point of view. And then when they engage with another character, it switches to that person's point of view. Now that person will then kill that person, and then they'll go into another battle, and then we'll switch to that person's point of view. It's so fun and intriguing, and I've never read anything like it other than what Joe Abercrombie's done. Maybe it's been done before, but oh man, it's fun to read about. And it's just everyone that I know that's read this book and The Heroes always talks about those moments as being like pinnacle battle sequences. Number 33 is Reaper by Will Wight. This is written in 2021, and it is book 10 of 12 of the Cradle series. And this is so hard for me to see this book written at number 33, because when I was going through and prepping for this video, I got to Reaper and I said, how is it that there's 32 better books than this on my list? And I went to go reorder it. And I just looked at the other books and I said, I guess all the books are just awesome of this, because I can't put any of them below this. But it's just crazy because I love Reaper. It's my favorite Cradle book, and I love Cradle. This book just rocks. I can't talk to you too much about the plot lines because we're 10 books in. But know that Cradle is like the definition of a progression fantasy. Progression fantasy is the style of fantasy where the characters get stronger and stronger over time on pretty linear basis. By the end of any book, they're a lot stronger than they were in the first book. It's really seeing them cultivate this power, these like training montage type of books that keeps you addicted to it. Very video game style, and I love everything about it. This book was so awesome for a number of reasons. One of them is the focus of the book is on a particular character that is almost everybody's favorite character. not going to say who it is, but if you've read the series, you know exactly who I'm talking about. This character rocks. And this book is a lot about that character's progression and where they're going from here on out. And I love that they got a bigger focus. I think that this book, in general, was largely about the characters entering a labyrinth in search for knowledge to help them advance to the next step and how to defeat, how do I say it without spoiling, the greater problem that exists, the big enemies on this planet. And they need to go on this journey to figure it out. It's fun for a number of reasons, because the beginning of the book was this kind of slower, kind of slice of life. Let's slow down from the crazy pace of the previous book and just get back in touch with their characters again. But then you see them forming this team, a team that they've had before. But, at this point, they have such chemistry with each other that it's so fun to see everybody have their backs. They're functioning at such a high level, taking out a threat that is so far above what you would ever think they'd be able to accomplish, and just doing such a good job together. I love that. It's such a feel-good story in so many ways. The ending, though, the ending's why this book is on my list. It is incredible. It rocked me to my core. Not in like the, oh, I'm crying thing that everybody says that most people don't do, but they say that. But rocked me because I did not see this coming. I kind of thought it was coming when I first started reading the series, like a book or two in. I was like, oh, what if X? But then as I went along, I was like, oh no, I'm crazy. That would never happen. That's clearly not what was happening here. And then it happened. And it destroyed me. I was floored. I had my jaw dropped to the bottom of my face. It just opened up all these possibilities for where the story's going. It was just such an incredible twist that took 10 books to set up. It's crazy good. And I think a lot of people saw it coming. I just didn't. I kind of forgot about it. I had convinced myself it wasn't happening, and it's wonderful. It's one of the top if I made a video of the best twists in all of fantasy, this would be pretty high up there. I love it. It got me so addicted to reading the next book. I didn't love the next book, actually, book 11, but I'm really hoping book 12 knocks it out of the park, and that comes out, I think, early on in 2023, and I can't wait to read it to see how this series wraps up. Number 32 is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This was written in 2007, and it is book 1 of 3 of the Kingkiller Chronicle. And this is another one where I'm betting not a lot of people have this book ranked where I have this. A lot of people would have it ranked higher. A lot of people would have it ranked lower. I find this book to be very polarizing for people, where people either love it or they kind of hate it. I really like it. I love this book. It's not one of my top all-time favorites, but I love so much about this book. And when I went back and reread this book, I didn't like it quite as much as the first time I read it, but I still really, really loved it. And I think part of the reasons I loved this book originally were where I was when I read it. It got me out of a major reading slump. I had gotten back into fantasy by reading A Song of Ice and Fire multiple times. And I thought to myself, like, that A Song of Ice and Fire is the pinnacle of fantasy, and I say this even though I've not read other fantasy books. But why would I read more books when this is clearly the best one ever? And it became clear pretty quickly that George R. R. Martin was not having his next book come out anytime soon. And I said, let's look at some other books in the fantasy genre that are really popular. And this was up there. And at that point, I was reading books rather slowly. And I busted through not only this book, but the following book on my honeymoon, which was not terribly long. And I just couldn't stop reading it on the beach. It was awesome. I loved it. It's a great book. It's got this framing narrative, and a lot of books have done this. Certainly a lot have tried to mimic The Name of the Wind, but The Name of the Wind also was not the first to do this. And what a framing narrative is where you have a character that's telling a story, where you kind of have multiple plot lines going on at the same time. In this book, you have this main character, Kvoth, don't know how to say his name. He is telling his life story to a chronicler. And as he's telling the story, he then goes into first person as the younger him, so you can hear it. But fairly frequently, they're jumping back to the present tense and then going back to hear the story. Most of it's that story, though. I love that narrative. It's the first time I'd ever read it in a book before, and it really, really worked. It really amplified the story. I don't think this book would be nearly as good if it didn't have that hook into it. The writing quality is sublime. I think everyone would agree that the writing quality is tip top when it comes to the fantasy genre. I'm not a big prose guy. I like it, but it doesn't make or break a book for me. But this is the one exception I'll have to that. It did make this book, and without the excellent prose, this book would have not been amazing because the plot is okay. It's not incredible. It did have me hooked, but I think part of the reason that it had me hooked was the way it was written was so fun and good to read about. I just kind of gushed over the way that the sentences were put out on that piece of paper. It just worked so well. You know, this is loosely just a story about a boy with a tragic childhood who's got some magical capabilities, going to a mage school. That's it. And, you know, the next book goes in different directions. I don't like the next book as much. I still really liked it. But this book just had so many things worked. You know, I could read this, and I will read it several times into the future. I think this is one of those books I'll probably read every 5 or 6 years, just because it's just going to put me in such a pleasant place. I love to read a writer that is so high quality as Patrick Rothfuss. And if you're putting off this book, because I found that it's kind of in vogue right now to slander this book, to say it's not good, I don't think that's true at all. I think people try to be cool sometimes. They try to be edgy. They try to take opinions that are contrary, and then sometimes that contrary opinion turns into the prevalent opinion over time. That certainly happened here. I don't think it's justified. Read this book if you haven't done it. Number 31 is House of Chains by Steven Erikson, written in 2002. This is book number 4 of 10 of Malazan, Book of the Fallen. And I'm so genuinely excited that I'm finally at the point in this long series that I'm doing where I get to talk to you about books from Malazan, Book of the Fallen, my favorite series of all time. I am super passionate about it, and I've never got to talk about these books on my channel before because I read them a long time ago, and I just have never had an excuse to really go book by book before. What's one of the reasons I made this series was so I can have an excuse to talk to you about these. Man, this book is awesome. And it's one of my least favorite books from Book of the Fallen. I think it's my third least favorite. This book series is sort of rocks. I don't want to tell you too much about what this book is about. I don't really want to tell you too much about what the series is about, but it's a intimidating series because it is very complex. There's like 1,000 main characters. There's literally hundreds of point of views. It is complex and it doesn't hold your hand. It throws you right into the midst and says, look, you don't know what's going on. Deal with it. You'll figure it out later. That is intimidating. When most book readers are used to, me included, getting kind of force-fed information, getting info dumps. You're not going to get anything like that in this series. But you still should read it anyways, because in my mind, it's the pinnacle of fantasy. In this book gets kind of slandered a little bit because it did a thing where for the first third of the book, maybe not a full third, maybe a quarter, but around that time, it was a single point of view. This whole series is famous for having rapid point of view changes over and over and over and over again. In a single chapter, you'll have 20 point of views. But they just did one point of view for many, many, many chapters. And it's this character named 𝐒𝐨𝐿. And he is this character that you love and you hate. You hate him because he's does horrific things that are unforgivable. But he's so powerful and important in the greater world where you can see that he's going to play this major part. And he's just awe-inspiring from I want to read this journey more, even though this character is just straight, I don't want to say evil, but primitive in the way they think, and that can have a lot of very, very bad things associated with who this character is for people that aren't in his worldview. But I loved the arc. I loved this different thing that Steven Erikson did by telling this single point of view. And the point of view ended in a really cool way, in a way that I did not see coming. And another jaw-dropping moment that really set up the rest of this book. Now, the rest of this book is not that story. It does a little bit of it, but it really is about this overall arc, about a march through this unforgiving desert for these two armies to face each other. And at the head of these two armies are characters that we love as the reader. And we see this tragic coming together that is a train wreck that you just have to watch. This is a story with huge tragedy, enormous redemption, epic moments. It's very tugging on your heartstrings at multiple times. It's wonderful. Now, there's a couple characters that I want to point out that are so important for making this book such a big deal to me. And one of them is a controversial character, and it's Malazan. And this is a character that a lot of people don't like. They don't like this character because she is hard for the other characters to like in the book, because she grates everybody wrong. It's like she's trying to be a dick to people. But I don't really connect with people that say that, because they're ignoring the enormous trauma that this character goes through at the beginning of their arc that forms who they are. And it's a very tragic character arc that this character continues to go on, that I have this enormous compassion for this character, and I wanted so many good things to happen to this character, and for them to try to become that better person that you know that they have inside of them, that you're just begging to come out. Another character that I want to highlight that really made this book for me was this character called 𝐒𝐴𝐳. And this is one of the funniest characters that I've ever read about in all of fantasy. And it's hard for me to just talk about this character and explain why this character is funny, because it's not so much the character themselves that's funny, I can't describe things about him that are going to make you laugh. It's just written so well. The way that he talks, the way he engages with his wife, the really hilarious dynamic that those two have together, the way this character views the world on this carefree way, on these serious events. They're immensely powerful, but play themselves off as not. I am in love with so much about what this character is and the development this character takes, not just through this book, but following books. So I urge you, more than anything I've ever urged you, please go read Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's absolutely incredible. Now, you might not love the first book. I didn't love the first book. I really liked it. The second book I did. And the third book I did even more. And in the fourth book, I won't say that it's better than the third, but man, it's awesome. And the series just continues to rock from that second book on. So go read 2 or 3 of these books before you make up your mind. But if you're anything like me, if you like this book 1/10 as much as me, you are going to love this series. All right, that's our 10. I am really looking forward to going through number 30 through 21 with you next week. I got some amazing books to talk to you about. I would love to connect with you between now and then. Come join the Discord. The description below has the link to it. I would love to talk to you about these books, what books you're reading, what books I'm reading. Let's talk spoilers. Let's have a good time. Thank you so much for sticking with me. And as always, happy reading to you.